So, kia ora, Te Aorangi, and thank you for agreeing to be part of this podcast series.
Kia ora, Robbie. Nice to be here.
So, we've been thinking about this as sort of notes on the country that I live in. So, you're probably going to be one of our youngest interviewees. So, most of your experience is over the last 20 odd years. So, tell me a little bit about how you formed your picture of the communities that we live in.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and you did right. I'm only, relatively young, and still tend to find myself as being the youngest on any kind of board or group I tend to get myself involved in. And I mean, I've been very fortunate to have, had exposure and experience in the community growing up. And as I was, some people might know and some people might not know, but I was homeschooled my whole life. I never went to school. I had to do my NCA subjects through correspondence, and so the way I guess we got that social, interaction or experience was in engaging in the community, was through engaging in the community, whether that be through, cultural things, whether that be through sport. Sport was really, was primarily the way in which we engaged with the community and met kind of like-minded individuals. And I kind of think homeschooling has a certain, kind of stigma that comes with it. And, and I'll be honest, there are reasons why people homeschool their children. The reason we homeschooled was obviously was because we were involved in the business, and mum and papa were traveling around the country a lot. And so we were kind of fortunate to be carted. And so it wasn't necessarily like we were brought up in one community alone. We were kind of exposed to, many different communities around Aotearoa, and also subsections of those communities. So yeah, it painted from me, I kind of think a very fortunate picture of who we are as a country, but yeah, also how how to kind of give back in a way, because there are lots that I engaged with. Over time, I've seen many of those who I engaged with, whether they're mates or whether they're young people, older people, that may not have necessarily been provided with the same opportunities that I've had growing up. And so, or they haven't necessarily taken opportunities that were provided with them. And so I think, that being able to give back to the community in one way or another is a way of being able to, say thanks for a lot of the opportunities that I've been provided with growing up. So, yeah.
Well, you had a fairly unique education. You grew up with a lot of te reo. You whakapapa to Ngāti Kahungunu, Ngāi Tahu, Ngāti Apa. So you would have had a very bicultural world view, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And so my mother's Māori. She's from Ngāti Kahungunu, as you said, Ngāti Kahungunu, Ngāti Apa, Ngāi Tahu. My father's a Pākehā, but would call himself a Māori. Just by he would claim that he's not. But that gave me a very obviously I was, Te Reo Māori is my first language. I was very fortunate to have been brought up with, you don't really realize it when you're growing up, how fortunate you are to grow up with Te Reo Māori as a first language, because it's very easy to learn English because everyone speaks it, right? But it's very difficult to pick up Te Reo Māori after you've learnt English, particularly in later years. And you see a lot of a lot of friends, a lot of people, acquaintances that are generally just on their journey of learning the language, and often they're on that journey. And, everyone's on a journey. I'm on a journey. Everyone's on a journey, but some people, are fortunate enough to be further along in their journey purely as a way, just through having learnt the language as a first language. And so you kind of don't realize it when you're growing up, but it's not until you get into, your later years where you realize. When I say later years of adolescence, where you realize, there's value and both economically and socially in learning and knowing how to speak Māori. So, yeah, very fortunate. And that was also a primary, one of the other reasons why we were homeschooled, is so that we could, myself and my siblings, were able to be brought up speaking Māori in the home. So, yeah, very fortunate from that sense.
So your transition into the formal education system was when you went to Waikato. How did you choose Waikato, and how did you choose what you were going to study?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting because the reason I chose to go to Waikato wasn't because of the reason I chose to study, or the topic I chose to study. So I did a Bachelor of Management Studies, majoring in finance, Te Reo Māori, and ended up squeezing in a minor in strategy, but that was kind of a bit of, there was kind of a bit of luck as much as anything. The reason I chose to go to Waikato was because I knew of its strength and history in the teaching of Te Reo Māori and its kura, its school, Te Wānanga ki te ao, and the influence that people like Pa Timoti Kāretu, Wharehuia Milroy, Pou Te Mara, Hirini Melbourne, Ngāhuia Dixon, all of these kind of preeminent Māori language speakers who were involved in that school. And that was partly the reason. That was a big part of me going to Waikato. My mother also went to Waikato and was fortunate enough to have been there as a student and as a lecturer while those people that I spoke about were there. So that was quite a big reason for my going to Waikato. In terms of studying finance was actually my kind of main kaupapa or main I guess subject I studied at university. And the reason I got into that was I was about 14 or 15 and I'd been working in our family business just running our online store, which was called the Haemata Reo store actually. And it was at a time, I guess, where there weren't so many Māori language resources available on the market, nowhere near as many as there are available today. And we're very fortunate today with the sheer number of Māori language resources that have been produced. But at this time, we're talking 10, 12, 13, 14 years ago where there weren't so many Māori language resources. And I guess it came out of a request from teachers that we were involved with on, regarding where they were able to access some of these resources. So I was involved in the setting up and the running of our online store. And I had about $2,000 or $3,000 anyway that I managed to save up over the course of a couple of years. And I kind of thought, where am I going to put this money? And so my parents said to me at that stage, they said, well, why don't you think about investing in the share market? Because, through our family trust, we kind of started on that journey at that time. And so they said, oh, well, we could put you in touch with, someone. So there I was, 14 or 15, calling up the investment advisors, calling up an investment advisor to say, hey, I've got $2,000. Will you actually take me on? Will you deal with me? And they were, I was very fortunate they did. And so I bought my first 4 shares, four shares in 4 different companies at the age of 14. And that was what really sparked my interest in markets and investment portfolios and the like. So, and that was what drove me to continue to further study that at university. So ended up doing that and then got very lucky to have done an internship at ASB. CBA, Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and ASB had their global markets team in Auckland on Wynyard Quarter. And I was very fortunate to have been given an opportunity to spend a few months there to further practice and learn about the big game that is capital markets. So yeah, that was kind of a bit of an insight into why I went to Waikato and why I chose to pursue the route of finance.
So how did you make your career decision? You weren't tempted just to follow that path into ASB and make your career there?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. I do reflect on it. And it wasn't really until I got to towards the back end of my last year at university, that final year, and I was fortunate that I had opportunities with some both banks, financial institutions, investment banking, and it was at that stage I kind of reflected a little bit on my time at ASB, and I kind of thought about myself and where I wanted to go and what it was that made me uniquely me. And part of that is my language. A large part of that is my language and who I am and my identity. In all honesty, that's not I didn't, while I was there doing my internship, I didn't necessarily see that as something that was valued in that world. And that was a large part of what drove me to make the decision to end up going down the route, that I have ended up going down. Um, it actually kind of paved its way for me. And so I made a phone call. It was just one afternoon. I made a phone call to my parents who were looking, who had started this business, Haemata, 25 years ago. This is their 25th year. So this was about, 5 years ago now. Um, and we just started talking about kind of my options. And I said, hey, this is actually, would you consider, offering, would you consider taking me into the business? And, um, whether we started to kind of map out the longer term of where the business was going to go and what the implications were for our family and also for myself. And then after that, we made the decision to kind of not necessarily give up, but just take a step back on going down that finance route, as a full-time career, and invest more of my time in our family business and building that. So that's what I've decided to pursue.
So tell me a bit more about Haemata.
Yeah, so Haemata is I guess it's a professional services consultancy that was established by my parents, Mark Fell and Te Aorangi Murphy, back in 1999. So this is our 25th year in business. And Haemata was established to support the aspirations of Māori in education. That was its primary focus and its vision. And a large part of that is also supporting the language, right? Over time, we've kind of broadened that kind of delivery scope, I guess, to include other sorts of services such as, capability building within the public sector, HR consulting, policy stuff. But the core business still very much remains education, so supporting our teachers in classrooms, Māori teachers, to be the best that they can be and to lighten their workloads, because often our kaiako and kura in schools take on additional workload pressures that non-Māori don't have to necessarily deal with. And I'll give you an example. Whenever there's a kapahaka that needs to be run, or whenever there's a pōhiri at the kura, often the Māori teacher will be the one that gets looked at to help facilitate and guide the school in that operation. And so it came out of one of our big projects is called Ako Panuku, and that came out of a cabinet appropriation, actually, that, and a bit of research that recognised that Māori teachers are faced with additional workload pressures. And so there's, a program of support that we provide is there to ease that workload pressure. So that's kind of our core business, is in education. My personal passion is more in, obviously, governance is one area, but te reo Māori and the revitalisation of the language is something that I'm very passionate about, and something I imagine I'll spend most of my life working on. It's not something you ever get to the end of and think, right, I've achieved it. But it's definitely a purpose, right? It gives me a lot of purpose in what I do. And so very fortunate to be able to come back and contribute and build on, what my parents had built up over 20 years, with the idea of continuing on for, as long as we can. We've got no plans to stop at the moment. So yeah, very lucky.
So you've chosen to go alongside this into governance, and you're the youngest chartered member of the Institute of Directors. Tell me about your decision to pursue governance and what value you want to bring to that.
I'm not really sure if it was the decision to get into governance or if it just kind of happened, in all honesty. And the first board I joined was the Squash Bay of Plenty board, and I received a phone call one afternoon, and it wasn't long after I finished at university, actually. It was only 2 or 3 months after, and they were looking for someone to represent the interests of the Eastern Bay of Plenty down here in Whakatane, where I'm living. And so I thought, oh, why not? I kind of gave it a bit of consideration, and I thought, well, I don't really know anything about, what it's like to be on a board, but I assume, I had a little bit of, I was on the committee here in Whakatane for 1 year before I went to university, and I thought, well, give it a go, right? And so that was kind of my entrance into the world of governance. And, I was very fortunate to have had the opportunity to serve on that board for the best part of 4 years, having recently come off. But it wasn't long after that, and I'm talking probably 3 or 4 months, that the opportunity to join the board of the BayTrust, one of the 12 community trusts in Aotearoa, it wasn't long after that I was presented with the opportunity to, well, the expression of interest was sent through to me, and I thought, well, they were looking for someone who was young from the Eastern Bay of Plenty, someone who was Māori, who had some knowledge of investments and understood te reo Māori and all of these things. And I kind of thought, well, that's probably, I kind of thought, oh, yep, tick, tick, tick. So I kind of, that was why I kind of put my name forward for that. And that's really, I've been very fortunate through that process, and now being on the BayTrust for the last 3 years, I've been very fortunate with the opportunities that I've been provided as a result of that role. And that's, including going through the chartered pathway with the Institute of Directors, and having opportunities that I otherwise wouldn't have had to develop my governance understanding and knowledge and skill. And I, completely acknowledge that, I'm only 3 or 4 years down the track of governance, and I've got a lot more to learn, and I still learn things all the time. And so I guess it's about being, particularly for young people coming onto boards, and I know, and I read a lot about it, that there's a willingness for boards to want to include more young people, or to bring more young people on. Firstly, from a diversity of thought standpoint, but also because it gives you a different perspective and a different viewpoint on matters. But I think it's also just as important that young people going onto boards, and I talked about this a little while ago, you're sitting there with, I'm, boards that I'm on with people who are double my age. It could be my, the age of my parents. And so there's a level of respect that you still have to maintain in those interactions. So while, it's important that you have, rigorous debate and all of these things at the board level, and are able to, respectfully critique people's thoughts and debate and all of that thing, things that make a good, robust board that, that give you good decisions. You've also got to balance that, that respect for people, because they have been around a lot longer, and, they understand a lot more. There's a lot more experience there and stuff. So I guess it's about not being whakahihi, not being too proud of yourself. And that's one thing that you've got to manage, but also understanding that, young people have a lot to contribute to boards. And so it's not a fine line, but it's just something that has to be considered, particularly for young people.
As a young person, and you describing your interactions with older people on boards, do you think that your experience in Te Ao Māori influences that part of your governance process as a young person in governance?
I guess partly. Obviously in Te Ao Māori you're brought up, and it's not just a uniquely Te Ao Māori thing, right? Everyone should respect their elders, and everyone should respect, regardless. Everyone wants to respect everyone, first of all, regardless of age or generation or anything. So it's not. I don't see it as necessarily just a Te Ao Māori thing. And it doesn't just apply to young Māori people who sit on boards. Young Pākehā, young anyone, right, on boards needs to still have a level of respect for their elders, because it's just, while you are on a board, and you are equal in all of these things, and you do have this, you might have the same number of votes and all of that as everyone else. There's still a social, it's bigger than that. It's bigger than that. And I see it as so. So, I guess that, having been brought up with an understanding of tika Māori and, Te Ao Māori worldview, I don't necessarily think it's something that should be only for Māori to consider, I guess.
In your board experience, so you're sitting alongside people who've been on boards for years, and you'll probably be seeing some really good governance behaviour and some perhaps that less ideal governance behaviour. Have you seen have you had experiences where you've thought that's amazing, like I can look at that person and really learn from them? Like, what's that process like watching experienced governors?
Absolutely. First of all, and I've been very fortunate with the people that I have sat on boards with, and also those who I'm not on boards with. Um, I think that's also just as important. And yeah, you're right. Sometimes you see things and you think, oh, that's probably not part of the 4 pillars of good governance or, governance practice or whatever. And sure, right? Um, you see examples of good governance practice and maybe not so good governance practice. And everyone has something to offer in that view. And I don't necessarily think you can say one person has got, is a perfect governor, because they're not. All right. Everyone has something to learn. But I've been very fortunate with the people that I have been able to sit on boards with, and in terms of observing that behavior. And I I'll take one example, and that's around conflicts of interest, right? We, and I guess this is partly also informed from um, it's maybe a conflict between, maybe what would be considered a Māori worldview and maybe a non-Māori worldview. But we kind of look at conflicts of interest as something, we kind of look at them in a negative light in some ways, and that, you've got to kind of identify them, you've got to declare them, then you've got to manage them, right? And you go to the company directors course, and they give you different frameworks on managing conflicts of interest, and red light, blue light, or green light, orange light, whatever color light. I In Te Ao Māori, I kind of see it in a different way, and we're inherently conflicted as people, right? Particularly as governors, because we sit on boards with other people and we're privy to information that, supposedly we're not supposed to be privy to, purely as a result of being on another board. And while you can look at that as being a really negative thing, I also think conflicts of interest bring with it a whole lot of positive things, because it enables you, particularly from a Te Ao Māori viewpoint, and particularly when it comes to knowing people and whatnot, because it gives you the ability to make better decisions than you otherwise would be able to make, purely on the basis of knowing um, what you know, or being privy to additional information. So I think, when I think about governance moving forward, and I know we haven't kind of got to this yet, but in terms of what's good governance practice and what's not so good governance practice, I also think there are things where we say, oh, this might not be such good governance practice, that can actually enable us to make better decisions than we otherwise would, had we not been in a conflicted situation. So I think, there are some things that generally we consider bad governance practice that I can think of, that I think, actually, if you kind of consider it from a Māori worldview, or, just Māori in general, um, you can kind of see it in a positive light as much as anything.
Yeah, and I think that evolution of understanding of governance and how to make it work best has been a really big focus, particularly for the community sector with Centre for Social Impact, trying to build that governance competence, but also realizing that, the governance that processes that we had 50 years ago may not necessarily be inclusive of other worldviews and other possibilities. So I think that's a really interesting area of exploration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, conflicts of interest is just one example, but I think as we move forward, and, 50 years ago, we weren't worrying about things like AI and climate change and all of these things. So there's a whole lot of different skills that we're requiring on boards now that you didn't necessarily require 50 years ago. And I think that's informing a lot of kind of how good governance evolves, because, it's all good, it's all well and good to know exactly, how to understand the governance, management, separation, or, how to manage conflicts, or how to deal with regulation, or any of these things. But you've also got to have actual technical expertise sitting on those boards. And, you're going to be hard pressed to find people, people that have got every single one of those capabilities. So I think we've also got to be open-minded about how good governance can evolve over time. Because boards that we've got nowadays and boards that we're going to have in 20 years' time or 30 years' time are not going to be the same, and not going to have the same requirements of skill set as what we had 50 years ago. And I think we've got to be, open to that.
So then looking forward 20 or 30 years, what's exciting for you and what's worrying for you about looking at Aotearoa from a long perspective as somebody who's relatively new on your career and you've got decades of contribution ahead of you, hopefully. What are you seeing? What are you?
I mean, I'm a bit of an eternal optimist in some ways that, I'm not so worried on, some of the big kind of things we talk about today, the big issues, like housing and climate change and AI and whatnot. And, everyone, we kind of, I sometimes think we get a little bit stuck on talking about the negatives. Where an actual thing, I think, if you kind of think 20 years time, 30 years time, a lot of these things are actually going to allow us to have a competitive advantage, both nationally and internationally as a country. And, I'll take kind of climate change as an example. People say, oh, what's the point of New Zealand kind of wanting to reduce its emissions because we're only, less than 1% of the world's, global emissions and all these things. And I get it, right? I totally understand. But I kind of think as a country, if it's generally a good thing to be involved in some of these conversations because you still require big players on the world stage. And um I was at a conference a little while ago talking with, and there were people from all over the world there. And in actual fact, New Zealand's leading the way in a whole lot of these things, right? We start talking about some of the things that we do on the BayTrust, or we talk about some of the things that, people in community trusts or the Centre for Social Impact or, other kind of organizations within the philanthropic sector in New Zealand are doing. We're actually world leading, right? In some of these areas when it comes to, progressive housing solutions or whether it comes to climate change or, how we're looking to implement AI on our boards, we're actually world leading in a lot of these ways. And I think that's partly because we are a small nation at the bottom of the world. And I think we have the ability to be a lot more agile than organizations, in kind of bigger global economic powerhouses, powerhouse countries can be. So, I'm really optimistic in terms of how we can leverage some of the issues that we're talking about today. And I think, 20 or 30 years time, I kind of hope, when it comes to things like climate change, I can kind of see that New Zealand will probably be, mostly, generating most of our energy from, renewables. And when it comes to AI, probably a lot of our board processes will be automated, and so we'll be a lot more efficient. And when it comes to housing, we've got some of the best solutions in the world in their backyard. And, I'm involved with a kaupapa at the moment called Pūrangakura, which is based out of Auckland, which are looking at Māori, focused housing solutions for the future. And, when you look at some of those things, it's a lot of the kind of, a lot of the solutions that are being generated through that project are world leading. They're better than some of the other, projects that are better than the solutions that are being produced through projects overseas that are, pouring millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars into it. So I think we often get caught up looking globally for solutions to some of our local issues, where I think some of the best solutions are actually sitting, on our shores.
Yeah, and I think that we often overlook the fact that, one, we're very connected. If you want to seek out, I don't know, scientific knowledge on something, it's relatively easy in New Zealand to find out who the person is and to make the connections with them, that handspan size of the population. And I remember somebody saying that New Zealanders traditionally do very well in multinational organizations because they start off here and they see everything in miniature, they know how all the pieces fit together.
Yeah.
And I think that's, in terms of innovation for the future, I think that's something that's really, really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the whole, 2 degrees of separations, some ways a really positive thing. I think there's also, it's like when you enter the world of governance, right? Everyone sits on every board, right? You go and meet with this you go and meet with this board. Oh, that, this person's on there. Oh, you go to that board. Oh, you're also on there. And I think the governance community in New Zealand's too small, first of all. And that's partly what gives rise to a lot of the conflicts of interest, the conflicts that we talked about earlier. So I think the more people we can kind of get into governance, the better. So that we can in some ways avoid some of that kind of 2 degrees of separation thing. But as you said, there are a lot of positives that can come from the fact that we are a small nation at the bottom of the world.
But I think also too, you're right. It's a very good argument for getting more young people in, because they're not part of the old established networks, and so they're going to bring not just new thinking, but perhaps a less connected perspective can sometimes be helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, a lot of the young people are the ones that are working on some of the groundbreaking technology that we've got coming out, like places, whether it's Rocket Lab or whether it's, working from Meridian Energy, working on the renewables or any, a lot of those kind of jobs are taken by young people coming out of universities because they're often some of the youngest and brightest. And so without kind of wanting to overload some of them, the kind of learning the governance practices, you can learn that, but often you can't learn good ideas if you know what I mean.
Actually, I love that. That's a great way to finish our conversation. You can't learn good ideas. It's about sharing
No.
what you know, and hopefully that will prompt other people into doing some creative thinking. And yeah.
Absolutely.
Hey, well, thanks very much for your time. This is our first podcast, and really appreciate you being the first person who agreed to do this.
Not a problem. Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Okay, we'll see you later.
No worries.